grew up in the 50s when we only had a couple of TV channels, BBC and ITV. And I was aware of the fact that my dad was a huge fan of what was then called variety. And there seemed to be, again, when you're a child you think these things, there seemed to be a lot of variety shows on TV, and I got to know various comedians. So you kind of follow your dad's taste in comedy, and he liked the Goons on the radio, and Tony Hancock, who eventually moved over to TV with Hancock's Half Hour. But there were lots of other comedians, some of whom, sadly, over the years have been forgotten. I remember a comedian called Dave King, who was quite successful in America. He had a kind of a Dean Martin kind of laid-back approach. He had a few hits as well. There was Charlie Drake, I remember, Jimmy James, who did a great drunk act, and with his stooge, our Eli, who was Eli Woods, a very tall, thin, morose-looking guy who was very funny. So many shows. The Army Game, I remember, with Michael Medwin and Ted. There were so many shows then, and I grew up loving comedy. And as you get into your teens, you start liking music and the Beatles and all that. But even so, I was a huge comedy fan. Would go and see comedy movies. I remember queuing up to see Norman Wisdom. He seemed to have 2 films out, one in the summer, one at Christmas, and I was always queuing around outside the Odeon to see Norman Wisdom. Jerry Lewis I went to see, and I eventually saw him on stage in London many years later, which was a thrill. In terms of starting to write comedy, I had no idea. I thought these guys made it up as they went along. And then in the early 70s, I started watching a lot of TV. And then I realised by watching the credits at the end of programmes that there were actually people who made a living writing jokes and sketches. Now, I left school at 16 with a couple of O-levels. English language, English literature. I wasn't very academic, but I was interested in, obviously, literature and words. And it was a general thing that I remember the first time I actually wrote any comedy was when I worked in a steelworks. We used to get a monthly magazine, the British Steel magazine. And I used to write, there were always pictures in there of the directors of British Steel, etc. And I can't remember how I started it, but I used to write these little balloon speeches and make them say funny things. And of course the guys in the office in the steelworks, they wanted me to, every time a new magazine would come out, come on Alan, write some more for me, which I did for a year or so and then forgot all about it. Then we went to live in South Africa and I came back, we lived up in Nottinghamshire. And it was while I was living in Nottinghamshire that I remember watching a TV show one night with a comedian who I was a big fan of called Billy Dainty, who was, he wasn't a verbal comic, he was very slapsticky, but with his strange dances. And poor old Billy, they put him in this sketch show and he wasn't very good in it. And I can remember watching it and thinking, God knows why I thought this, well, I could write better than that. And of course I tried, and I had no skills, I had no writing skills at all, but every night I'd come back from work and I'd be sitting at the kitchen table trying to come up with ideas and jokes. And eventually I had the courage to send off some sketches to our local TV station, which, even though we lived in Nottinghamshire, was Yorkshire TV. And they were making another series with Les Dawson. And I sent some sketches off, and lo and behold, about 3-4 weeks later, I get a letter back from David Nobbs. Now, David went on to write Reggie Perrin, famously, and a lot of great books as well. But at that point, he was the script editor at Yorkshire TV. And I've still got the letter, and David said, we've received your sketches, and we've recorded one of your sketches. It was a caveman sketch with Les and Kathy Staff, who was in Last of the Summer Wine. Could you please send some more? Well, I'd taken ages to write those first couple. Suddenly, I'm hurriedly writing the follow-up sketches, sent them off, and of course, they weren't very good. But when the series finished, by the way, I had a cheque, which I've still got a copy of, which is unbelievable to get paid for something like that. When the series finished, David Nobbs took the trouble, when he moved back down to Hertfordshire, to send me a 3-page handwritten letter giving me advice about how to get on in comedy. And he also gave me some names of producers who were looking for material. Now, bearing in mind this was the late 70s, how you would get into comedy these days, I suppose you become a performer, I guess, and write your own stuff. But back then, television needed writers to write material for comedians who didn't write their own. And so there was a huge market, if you could get into it, and it took me a long, long time to get into it, to write for variety shows and game shows and that sort of thing. I started to send news items into the two Ronnies, and again, you don't realise at the time that they get hundreds and hundreds of these news items every week when they're running. I think they made 6 shows a year, so the chance of getting any news items on the two Ronnies they were quite slim. But I managed to get some on. Then the following series, they asked me to write some more, and then I got a sketch on there. It was a Christmas or Boxing Day show of 1981, and I remember it. The two Ronnies Christmas special went out just before. I don't know why I remember these things. The TV premiere of The French Connection. So it was a big TV night, and I think 21 million people watched that two Ronnies. And it was a sketch called The Annual Convention of Limerick Writers. And to this day, every now and again, I'll still get a cheque from the ALCS for repeat fees for being shown over in Borneo or wherever, all over the world, and for sales of DVDs and CDs. So that was it was quite a big thing for me. And I did meet Ronnie Barker very briefly when I'd gone up to London. I took the opportunity to ring up Ian Davidson, who was the script editor of the Ronnies, after I'd had a few news items on there, and I happened to mention I was going to be in London at a certain time. I was going to a science fiction movie convention. And I remember him saying, "Tell you what, pop in, we'll have a cup of tea and a bun." Just like that. Now for me, to come from Newport to TV Centre was a massive thing. For him, it was like drop in. So and I did drop in, and I dropped into the BBC, and I was expected at the gate. I was sent up to the office. Ian was very enthusiastic about what I'd written. And I remember he went into a filing cabinet, and there was a file on me, with all the jokes they'd used and they were going to use. And he said, "Oh, on Sunday night we're recording the Rons." He said, "Do you fancy coming along to a recording?" Of course, and he said, "Tonight," he said, "we're recording a show with Les Dawson called The Dawson Watch, which was a new show. Do you fancy coming along to that?" Well, the convention I'd come up to, the movie convention, wasn't starting until the Saturday anyway. So I came along that night, and I met Les Dawson, and I always remember saying to him when I was introduced, I wrote some sketches for you for Says Les, the caveman sketches. And Les looked me up and down and said, "Yeah, those sketches went very well. You can buy me a drink." And I swear, on the bar, there were at least 2 or 3 double whiskies, and he'd had a couple already. I was happy to buy him a double whiskey. And when he went on the set for the Dawson Watch, he was word perfect. You would never know he'd downed a couple for his nerves, I guess. Anyway, on the Sunday night, I turned up at TV Centre again for the Ronnies recording, and I was ushered into the gallery. And who should be sat next to me but a writer called John Sullivan, who at that point was well known for Citizen Smith. And as a lot of coincidences happened in my life, about 3 weeks before, I read in one of the Sunday papers an interview with him, how he got into the BBC a couple of years before as a scene shifter, so he could hand scripts in to producers, and that Citizen Smith had got made without exaggeration, 3 or 4 weeks of him handing the first script in to the producer, Dennis Main Wilson. They made the pilot. Well, that would never happen now. It would go through 25 different levels of management before anybody approved a pilot. Anyway, for some reason that day, I'd not had lunch, and I'd rushed across London from Bloomsbury to the TV Centre without having eaten anything. And John Sullivan turned to me and he said, "Are you okay?" I said, "Well, I just feel a bit..." He said, "I know. Somebody please get a sandwich and some crisps and a drink for Alan," which he didn't have to do because I only met him 5 minutes before, and he was really interested about the fact I still had a proper job, and I was he'd been through all that himself, but he was well established, having written Citizen Smith. And in the car park afterwards, as I said, she wrote him, Ronnie Barker walked up and John introduced me, and Ronnie remembered I'd written, I think, 2 of the jokes that night, which was how I was overawed, talking to Ronnie Barker. And he apologised for messing up one of the jokes, which I think he did deliberately, because sometimes comedians do that to get an extra laugh. And the joke was something along the lines of, tonight at the Albert Hall, tonight the staff of Pickford's packed the Albert Hall. Then they wrapped Nelson's column in brown paper. It was a terrible, perfectly terrible joke. On the night, Ronnie Barker referred to the stiff of Packford's, getting that extra laugh, which is, I'm sure he did it deliberately. But anyway, it was just a great thing for me. So in the following couple of years, John was very good to me. I'd send him ideas and etc. And he'd say, well, that won't work. And he sent me a Citizen Smith script showing how a sitcom script was written. And then I went to stay with him up in, he had a house in Sutton in Surrey, and I stayed there, and he took me out for a meal, etc., and sat me down and said, look, this is what you need to do, you're going wrong there. And he was so good to me, and he didn't have to be. And I've still got it, and I only found this about a year or so ago, and I don't know why I didn't act upon it, possibly because I still had a proper job, and I didn't have the confidence, but I got a letter from John Sullivan with a sketch show called Nitty Gritty, which he'd written, and this letter, which I looked at, say, about a year ago, and I can't believe I didn't act on it, said, here's a pilot script I've written, I've got a producer interested in making it, I think you and I have got the same sense of humour, would you like to rewrite it with me? And to this day, I can't remember why I didn't do anything about it. Possibly because, as I say, I'd still had a proper job, a 9-to-5 job. But we kept in touch for a long, long time, and I met him once again in London. I do remember when we went out for a meal one night, he was talking, he said, I've got this idea about the sitcom, these 2 brothers. They're 2 brothers, one's older, he's kind of protective of the one who's a bit dim, but he said, I can't place where they live. And it was only about a year later that, of course, I saw the first episode of Fools and Horses, and that was the gestation of Fools and Horses. I was there right at the beginning. And I do have a Fools and Horses script, which I treasure, and along with the correspondence from John. So, John Sullivan, in my book, was a diamond, as they say. When I started out writing, I was sending material to every TV show, every radio show, Weekending, Marx in his diary with Alfred Marx. I got a few bits and pieces on that. The headlines, I did quite a bit for the headlines. That was one of my first radio successes. And I do remember we had a phone installed. God, it was like fantastic to get a phone in those days. And I remember ringing up a BBC producer one day. I said, it's Alan Wightman here. And he said, oh yes, Alan, we've got some of your stuff. I think it was the Weekending office. Weekending was a topical radio show every Friday on Radio 4. And I'll tell you who was the script editor on that for a while. Douglas Adams, who I met, who went on to write Hitchhiker. And taken over from that was Griff Rhys-Jones. He was script editor as well. But I didn't meet Griff, but I had a long chat with Douglas one day. Anyway, so I was speaking to a producer on Weekending, and he was very encouraging about what I'd written. I think I had a sort of a pretty good hit rate. Not every week I had stuff on, but some weeks. And he said, by the way, he said, if you want to make a career of show business at some point, I've got some advice for you. And of course, I was all ears. I wanted to, he said, get yourself a typewriter. Because up until then, I've been handwriting until somebody tells you in your naivety. I mean, I wasn't a kid, I was in my 20s, but I had no idea. How do I get myself a typewriter? I think a son had been born then, and I wasn't earning a lot of money, and I didn't know how much a typewriter cost. So I'm on the phone to my mum down in Newport, and I explained, I said, I need a typewriter. And she said, leave it to me. Now, in those days, Mum and Dad smoked. And they used to collect embassy coupons. You could go to a shop that was an outlet for embassy coupons, and you get a gift, whatever you wanted. Now, we lived, say, in Nottinghamshire, and there was a John Player factory shop in Nottingham. And that's where our local shop was to transfer these these embassy coupons. So anyway, over the course of about a month, every couple of days, these embassy coupons would turn up in the post. And she couldn't have smoked that many cigarettes. What she'd do, people would sell them to her, and they bundle them up like 20, 30 at a time, and she posts them to us. So eventually I had enough embassy coupons to get on the bus, go into Nottingham, go to the John Player shop one Saturday morning, and exchange these Green Shield, I keep saying Green Shield, these embassy coupons for a typewriter. It was one of those portables with a hard plastic shell. But of course, then you've got to bring it home, then you've got to learn to type. And I don't know if anybody remembers ribbons, but the red and black ribbons were a nightmare to change. But I did. I taught myself to type. And then things started moving a little bit for me. Then we moved back to Newport. But I couldn't afford copy paper. So I used to go around all the estate agents at lunchtime, take details, these details from of houses for sale, and there were always a blank sheet on the back. And I used that for copy paper. When I lived in Mansfield now, this is back in 76, 77, I was selling stuff off to everybody. I got a job down here, and then I started writing for the Ronnies, which I've explained about, and then around it would have been 1982, there was an ad in the Stage newspaper, which I get every week, and the ad said, semi-name comedian needs scriptwriters. So I answered it, and it was a comedian called Jeff Stevenson, who I'm still friends with now, years and years later. He's a big actor on the cruise ships now, Jeff. And again, it was about a year after the previous convention. I went to another movie convention in London, and I happened to mention to Jeff I was up there. He said, well, we'll have lunch on the Monday. So we met up, we got on all right, and I'd sent him some sample material, which he liked. And so for a couple of years, I wrote a lot of stuff for Jeff, and he got a few TV shows. There was a TV show called Entertainment Express he was on, Starburst and things like that, and I'd go up to Elstree with him, take a day off work, still had a proper job, go along, and I'm meeting all these stars like the Platters and Mike Reed and so many different people I met, and then back to work the next day. And eventually Jeff got a show on Channel 4. There was 6 shows called The Entertainers, and if I tell you that each individual show had people like French and Saunders on one, Hale and Pace, Joe Longthorne, who'd just come back from Las Vegas, and Jeff had his own show, and that was the first commission I had to write a show. I was commissioned by the producer rather than the act saying, here's a few quid, would you write some material for me? And this show was the Jeff Stevenson show, The Entertainers, recorded at London Weekend Television, which over the next few years I got to know very well. Yeah, I always thought the London Weekend Television was kind of like a mini Hollywood. It was always a bit more glamorous than BBC. It was so many big shows were coming from there. And on this 30-minute sketch show, we had Frank Bruno was a guest, Chris Rea was the music guest. It was quite a thing. And Jeff then got a game show called Jumble, which was a daytime game show. And out of The Entertainers, he also got a show called Knees Up, and which we used to record on a Friday. I'd take a Friday afternoon off work. I mean, when I think about it now, it's really weird. I used to finish work at 1 o'clock, get a 1:30 train to London, get up to London Weekend Television. We record 2 Knees Ups, which was originally Chaz and Dave's Knees Up, set in this East End pub, which was a studio in London Weekend. And Jeff was the host, and I used to meet. There was people like Anita Harris was on one, The Searchers, The Bachelors, Lonnie Donegan, Eric Burden from The Animals. It was just a lot of young comics coming through, including a very young Brian Connolly, the Irish comedian Adrian Walsh, who eventually I got to know, and we shared an agent and still do. And I would get the late train back. It was just the most bizarre thing. We record 2 shows every Friday, and it was at that point, nobody where I worked knew I had this side job. I was like Clark Kent and Superman, you know. I had the secret identity that no one knew about. And a couple of weeks later, and it's never happened since, I had 2 shows on TV the same night. 7:15 was Knees Up on the Sunday night. 7:45 was Live from Her Majesty's, which I got off the back of being a writer on Knees Up. And I was in work on the Monday morning, and somebody said, "Oh, I saw your name on TV last night," or someone, because Alan Wightman is quite an unusual name, the spelling. And I said, "Oh, it was live from Her Majesty's," and they said, "No, knees up." And someone said, and anyway, my secret was out. Final knees up show. I went up to the bar after this recording, and I always just have a quick drink before I caught the train back to Newport. And David Bell, who was to say head of entertainment and also the producer, he said, "You can stay." He said, "I want you to write for Jimmy Tarbuck for Live from Her Majesty's." Now, this was the second series. Live from Her Majesty's the year before, I'd been sending stuff in with no luck because they had their own team of writers. 12 months on, I'm now being asked to write for Live from Her Majesty's, which is a massive show. And I remember I was sending stuff I initially sent stuff into David, material for Jimmy, but eventually David said, "Look, just send it direct to Jimmy." He gave me Jimmy's address, and I was sending stuff. And what I'd do, on a Thursday night, I remember going in or just walking into town to the post office, last collection, and Jimmy would get the stuff the next morning. It was long before faxes and emails. Anyway, it was coming up to the very first show, and no one had said, "We want you there." I was desperate to be there at the theatre, and no one had said anything about "We want you there." I presume they just assumed I was going to be there. And every Saturday afternoon at 4 o'clock, Wally Molson, who was the head writer, would ring me, and this was the first Saturday. He said, "Any more material for Jimmy?" Because I'd been sending stuff all week, and I had another, I don't know, half a dozen jokes for him. And then before he put the phone down, Wally said, "Right," he said, "Jimmy's in at noon. The writers come in an hour before. See you tomorrow morning." I'm sitting there, I put the phone down to Wally, and I'm expected to go to London the next day. Well, I had a couple of pounds in my wallet. I can't remember what the train fare was back then, but I didn't have enough money really to get to London. Didn't have a credit card then. And the only alternative was to open the children's money boxes we were saving for the summer holidays. So I took the couple of pounds and added it to what I had in the wallet, and I got the train to London. There was a train, and I did get to the theatre in time. Not to backtrack again, but a couple of years before, there was a show on Saturday nights called Saturday Royal, which came from the Theatre Royal Nottingham, hosted by Bernie Clifton, who, again, I shared an agent with years later. This is, it was like a fantasy island thing for me. I used to watch Saturday Royal, and it was always the top of the bill, the usual things, various acts, then the top of the bill. And I thought, wouldn't it be great to work on a show like that and go into the theatre and be part of it all? This is years before Live from Her Majesty's. So there I was on that first Sunday. I was expected, walked in, cup of tea, sit down in the stalls, and I met the writers, and then I eventually met Jimmy. And it was kind of surreal that I was expected at this wonderful theatre, which I'd been to. I'd seen a show there a couple of years before, and there I was working there. And it was all very surreal to me and I remember meeting Jerry Stevens, who was the comic on the show. The very first act on was, there was a big show at the time called the Dukes of Hazzard, American show that everybody watched on a Saturday night. And John Schneider was one of the stars, and he happened to be a singer as well. And I remember Jimmy introduced him from the Dukes of Harris. Now, it's so easy to make a mistake on these live shows because the nerves, Now, I was on the side of the stage. What I wanted to say was that was one of the hazards of a live performance. And I'm glad I didn't, because Wally Malson, who was the head writer, he said it. And if I'd jumped in and stepped on Wally's toes, I don't think I'd have been in favour for a while. But it was so that series was just amazing for me, because every week there was a top of the bill. The first show, top of the bill, was Shirley Bassey. And there was always a massive... We had Dion Warwick, we had Victor Borgia, Cliff was on. What was memorable about Live from Her Majesty's, and will always stay with me, when I got the series, I think it was the first show, I managed to get one joke on. Jimmy Tarbuck used one joke, which was pretty good for a first show. By about third show along, we had Glenn Campbell on the bill, Russ Abbott doing "See You, Jimmy." It was Lulu. It was like a Scottish theme one, because David Bell, who was the head of London Weekend Television and the producer, was Scottish, and he had this big Scottish thing. I think somebody sang a song from Brigadoon as well. Anyway, Jeff Stevenson, Cockney Comic, happened to be on the bill as well. And at the end of the show, in the green room, I saw David Bell pointing at me and pointing at Jimmy, and Jimmy called me over. Now, this is only my third or fourth show, and I thought I was going to get sacked, because he said, I want to work with you next Sunday. So the next Sunday, April the 15th, 1984, I get called up to the dressing room in the afternoon, thinking I was going to get fired, and Jimmy and his manager, Peter Pritchard, said, "We want you to write for Jimmy on a retainer, writing material every week. We'll guarantee you're on every TV show he does in future. He'll want stuff for cabaret and summer season and that kind of thing. Some weeks you won't have to write anything, but other weeks he'll ring you up and he'll expect you to." And that was massive. I mean, when you think I was an insurance broker and trying to break in, this was a massive step change for me. Well, April the 15th, 1984, any fan of great comedy will know that date was the date Tommy Cooper died at Her Majesty's. And I was there, obviously, he was one of Tarby's writers. And during the day, I remember it was a very special day. Mum and Dad came up. Mum was a huge fan of Howard Keel, who was also on the bill. Dad was a lifetime Tommy Cooper fan, so the chance to see Tommy Cooper. Dad was he was ex-railway, so he had free passes, so he had free tickets to the theatre and free travel. And they came up to the show, and I met him in the evening to put him in their seats. But during the day, during the rehearsals in the afternoon, Tommy came out, and I remember sitting in the stalls. The flying pickets were there, Adrian Walsh, Johnny Osmond. We were all watching the rehearsal. David Bell was down the front, who was the producer, with his monitor. And Tommy came out, and I remember he had a bicycle handlebars, and he was ringing this bicycle handlebars, and it was just so funny. I mean, bits and pieces and props, etc. And we were all roaring with laughter instantly. And he suddenly stopped, and he walked to the lip of the stage, and David Bell, producer, he sat there, and he said to David, "By the way, David, I won't be doing any of this tonight." Well, of course, uproar, wasn't there? We just roaring with laughter. He did, of course, did quite a bit of what he was doing. And that night, I was on the side of the stage with my co-writers, with Jimmy, and we couldn't see the stage because there were long black drapes hiding the stage from us, but we used to watch the show on a monitor. And normally, those shows would have a music act first, then a comedian, but because Tommy was closing the first bit, it opened with a comic, which is not great for a comic to open a show, but Adrian Walsh did a lovely routine. Flying Pickets followed him, and then Jimmy said, "Right, here's the comedian, Tommy Cooper." Tommy came out, did this great routine, hysterically funny, and it was going to end with him having this cloak put on him by one of the dancers, Brian Rogers' dancers, and he was going to produce all these ridiculous things like ladders and a wooden leg or whatever coming from underneath it. And the idea was that Jimmy was going to come through at the end and say, "I'll see you all in part 2. Well, we're watching the monitor, and we can see all of a sudden the dancer, I can't remember the girl's name, blonde dancer, she put the cloak around him, and Tommy said, "Thanks, love." So his last words were, "Thanks, love." And he suddenly fell back, and we didn't know whether this was part of the act, but we could hear him make a noise, a strange noise. And we went straight into a commercial break. Just before that, when we saw this on the screen, Jimmy said, "He's gone." And we all froze. It was only a second, but it seemed like time had stood still. And even then, even though I still had a proper job, and I knew I'd be going to work the next day, I knew I was part of showbiz history in that instant. Well, it was chaos. It was chaos. We went round, and Tommy was lying there. Apparently, a policeman was walking past the stage door. He got on the phone to the ambulance. One of the assistants was trained in CPR and was trying to revive Tommy. But I think he was gone already. I think he was gone. So, of course, what do? Jimmy is standing there, and David Bell turned up and said, look, we need an extra 4 minutes. Somehow he got onto network TV, and they managed to give him another 4 minutes, which is not easy to do, the extra 4 minutes of the programme. We had to put 4 minutes together of material for Jimmy to give them time to get Tommy away. So this is my third or fourth show. I was, quite naive at the time, and I was trying to remember jokes I'd seen Jimmy do in the past, and we managed to concoct a 4-minute routine for him, which he went out to do, which he did. Considering he's in front of these curtains behind which they're trying to revive Tommy, and the ambulance turned up. Anyway, it was horrible, and. The first act on after that was Les Dennis and Dustin G, and they came out and did their routine in front of these curtains, which shouldn't have been there normally. On Live From, there were never any curtains. They were put up specifically for Tommy's act to bring the props through. So Les and Dustin did their act. I remember Dustin did a Robert Mitchum impression and he dropped the cowboy hat, and Jimmy picked it up, made some reference to Clayton Fowler from Dallas, introduced Howard Keel again in front of the curtains. By the time we came to the second commercial break, those are the days when there were only 2 commercial breaks an hour, there's about 6 now, the curtains had parted and Tommy had been taken to the hospital. And it was just as well, because I remember watching the rehearsal of the afternoon that Donny Osmond came on from the side of the stage. He was doing a song called Chain Reaction, and he came out with the dancers and he did all his hits, and when the walk down came, everybody came out apart from Tommy. And I remember going to the green room afterwards, and normally we'd have a drink and a chat. They put the news on straight away at 9:15, BBC News, and it said Tommy Cooper had died on his way to hospital. Well, of course, everybody slunk away really. There was no point hanging around. And Mum and Dad and I got in the cab to go to Paddington, and it was on the radio, and somebody talking to the cab driver said Tommy Cooper's just died, just like that. So we get it was unreal. And I remember getting the train back, and what was also strange, the following day, and this was still a time when nobody knew I had a secret job, if you like. Everybody in work's looking at their daily papers, and they'd obviously, a lot of them had seen it, some hadn't seen it, but they read it in the papers that Tommy Cooper had died. Well, there was no way that Alan Wightman, an insurance broker, is going to say I was there last night, because they'd call the men in the white coats, wouldn't they? It was a couple of weeks later that they found out that I was the secret identity. But it was very strange the following Sunday to go back to the theatre and see Norman Collier, who was the first act on rehearsing in the morning. I thought, what a brave soul you are to get on there the week after Tommy had, and try and be funny. And he was great. He did a great routine he had a car door type prop, and he was all props with Norman. And I did the microphone thing with the microphone going wrong. He was great. But it was never the same. It was never the same, I don't think. No mention of Tommy at all. It was straight into this. He just came out cheerful, what he called himself, the chubby funster. He'd come out and straight into a routine, covering quite well, You'd never know. You'd never know what was going on. Les and Destin, you'd never know. Howard Keel. The only problem was to say that they had this. There's the curtains. There's the lip of the stage. They didn't have very much space there, whereas they would normally have had time to move around, But Howard Keel, bless your beautiful hide, all that. He was all the stuff, Oklahoma, and the Mum and Dad were enthralled by it all, I mean, my dad. During like Uncle Albert, during the war, my dad was one of the George Mitchell singers. Now, George Mitchell eventually became in charge of the Black and White Minstrels, which we don't talk about these days. But during the war, Dad did quite a lot of shows with them. They were ex-army, he had a chance just after the war, early 50s, when George Mitchell, after everybody was getting back to normal after the war, and George Mitchell asked my dad to join the George Mitchell singers that were going professional, and my mother wouldn't do it because it would be moving to London, and she didn't want to leave our mam. And her mum, that is, Nana Kubica, my Spanish granddad, my mother. And so Dad had that opportunity. So he was always interested in show business, and I often wonder what would have happened. Would I have admitted that my dad was one of the black and white minstrels? I don't know. But they became huge. Black and white minstrels, they ran at the Victoria Palace for 2 years, miming, always miming. And it would say on the poster, and why would you go and see people miming, When Live from Her Majesty's finished, I went, I had a proper job, so I had work to do. And then I got a call from Jimmy to say that they're doing a series in the autumn called Tarby and Friends, and you're going to be on that. So start prepping material for that. Then he mentioned he was in summer season in Eastbourne, and we were in Weymouth on holiday. No, where was he? He was in Bournemouth, he was in Bournemouth. So I took the family, we went to see him in Bournemouth, and he was very good with the kids. It was just, again, it was all very surreal. It was like a massive step up from just sending stuff in and getting it accepted or quite often rejected. So we did Tarby and Friends, and again, every show there was I think Jack Jones was on, Victor Moan, Anne Murray, who was she had a big hit record out, Mary Osmond. There was always an American John Denver was on one of them as well. But all the time I was working as a proper job and still writing for Tarby. Then there was another series of Live from Her Majesty's in the autumn of '85, during which I had an eye problem. I had to have an eye operation, so I had to opt out of that. But what was great was they still kept paying me, and I did manage to get to the last show, which was I'm trying to think who was on it. It was a massive show. Anyway, Mary helped me, my wife helped me get up there, because I was in a bit of a state with my eyes. And then we did Live from the Piccadilly, which is a tiny theatre, but again it was massive stars, and I remember working with the Everly Brothers, and it was, again, surreal. And then I get the call in 1987, bearing in mind that the Live From's series had to come from theatres that were available, because theatres were obviously had shows on, all of a sudden the Palladium is available for Live from the Palladium. I grew up watching Sunday night at the Palladium, and it was a big thrill for me. And I always remember walking, it's different now, that they've changed the Palladium. There used to be these big black metal gates that were opened for you, and you walked down a ramp to the stage door, and my name was on the door. I was waiting for someone to say, "Come on, you don't belong here," and that's how I felt at the time. But the Palladium, the work Live from the Palladium was amazing, and so many stars. And Jimmy was very generous with me. We did 3 series from the Palladium, and the final one was a 90-minute special that we had. Barry Manilow was the top of the bill. Cliff was on there. And there was the pop band Bros, and it was the closest I ever got to Beatlemania, because Argyle Street outside the Palladium and Great Marlborough Street were absolutely packed with teenage girls screaming for the 2 Bros kids, Matt and Luke, isn't it? Matt and Luke Goss. And I'd never seen anything like that. The street was absolutely heaving. And what was interesting for me, because of being a music fan as well, I was watching 3 different generations of pop act. You had Manilow, who was fairly new, Cliff, who'd been around forever, and Bros, who were like flavour of the month. And I've still got that on DVD. Someone did a copy for me, which I often watch. But that show, that 90-minute, we had Jimmy, Russ Abbott on there, Kim Wilde was on there, Roy Walker. It was a real night. It was a real variety show. And that was the end of it. Now, that following year, Jimmy was dropped. London Weekend Television dropped him. Things were changing in comedy. That the alternatives were coming in, and that some people at London Weekend thought Jimmy had his day. So I had another year with him writing his live act, and then suddenly my 5 years with him stopped. And I thought, well, that's it now. My career's over. I'll concentrate on my day job. I was still doing bits and pieces for comics, But, you know, earning 30 quid here and 50 quid there, you know, there was no way I could have gone full time. Once the live proms finished and the Tarby and Friends finished and Late Night Tarby, all those shows finished, I did a bit more for Jimmy for his live work, and it all kind of petered out. And I mean, I had 5 years with him, so it was great. I mean, it's a huge step change for me. But a year went by, and I was still doing bits and pieces for people, but nothing very much. And I always remember a friend of mine went out for a drink one night, and I must have looked a bit down. And he said, "The thing is, you must remember," he said, "you did it. You know, a lot of people try these things, but you actually did it." And I thought, well, yes, but I want to keep doing it. I don't want it to be something I look back on. I'm only in my 30s. I still want to. And anyway, not long after that, I got a phone call in work. It was most bizarre, from Tony Crutchley. Tony was the stage manager on all the live proms, or any big London Weekend show. He was one of those guys who could do any. I remember Dusty Springfield on one of the shows. She burnt a coat on a stage light or something. He managed to get her coat fixed to look brand new on a Sunday in London. How he did it, I don't know. But by the time she went back, she was fine. So he was one of those guys. He was a fixer, get everything done. So when the phone rings and it's one of the girls in the office said, "There's a Mr. Crutchley for you." So I picked the phone up, and of course it's an open plan office, and it's one of those moments where everybody's quiet. You don't hear a word from anyone, right? And "Hello, Tony, how are you?" And he said, "What are you up to these days?" I said, "Well, I'm doing bits of pieces." He said, "I'm stage managing the BAFTA Craft Awards in Glasgow in a month." He said, "We're looking for a writer. Would you be interested?" "Yeah, what do I have to do?" He said, "Well, it's just you write intros and we've got Magnus Magnuson and his daughter, and there'll be 12 celebs doing." And he said, "Would you be interested?" I said, "Yeah, I'd love to do it." And of course came the question, "How much would you want?" And I'm in the office now, open plan, and everybody's earwigging. So I went, £1,000? £1,000. He said, "Yeah, we can do that." And I thought, I should have asked for 2. I mean, I just grabbed that figure out of the air, you know. It was a phenomenal amount, you know. So about a month later, I get the sleeper. I get the sleeper train from Bristol up to Glasgow. And it's a funny story here. I didn't know. I've never ever been on a sleeper train before, an overnight sleeper. So I get in my little room, and I get into bed, and the door opens, and another bloke walks in. "Evening." And I thought, Christ, I have to share this with somebody I've never met before. Had I known, I didn't realise afterwards, had I slipped the guard a couple of quid, he would have found me one on my own. Anyway, I was on the top bunk, as it turned out. It was most bizarre. Anyway, he asked me what I was doing. He said, he was something to do with Doctor Who. But it was the fag end of the series at the time, before it became big in BBC Wales. So we're talking about Doctor Who. I'm on the top, he's on the bottom bunk. And eventually I said, look, it was like 2 in the morning, and I got to sleep. Anyway, the next thing I know, we're in Birmingham. I can hear noises on the station. And the next thing I know, we're in Glasgow. And this guy knew Glasgow, and he told me how to get to the underground train to the Glasgow Arena, and the hotel was right next to it. So I get to the hotel. I hadn't slept really all night, because when you're on a sleeper train, it's like you're going downhill all the way. It wasn't great. So I get to my hotel, where I was told I'd have a room ready so I could get changed and showered and everything before this first meeting at 10 o'clock. There was no room ready. So I turned up at this meeting, unshaven, tired, with Magnus Magnuson and his daughter Sally, they were hosting the show, and they were lovely. Both of them were really, really nice. John K. Cooper, who was the director and producer, and I'm trying to, really trying to stay awake. It was terrible. Anyway, eventually I made notes, went back to my room, and for 3 days I stayed in my hotel room with various people knocking on the door with notes for me to write. And I stayed in the hotel for 3 days, Friday, Saturday, and all day Sunday. I didn't go down into the arena till the Sunday afternoon. And that's when all the stars started arriving. People like Alan Wicker, Stanley Baxter, Keith Barron, one of my favourite actors. It was a whole bunch of people, and so Richard Attenborough was going to be a special guest. So I wrote all that. And it was very strange, because I was so shy then, having had a year out of the business. I didn't know. I was really, really if you like, introvert at that point, I just sat at the back the whole afternoon. I didn't speak to anybody. And until I bumped into Sir Richard Attenborough, who said some nice things about the script, and I just exchanged a few words with him. And then John K. Cooper walked up to me and said, "Alan," he said, "I've been looking for you." He said, "I'm doing a special in a couple of weeks with Richard Digance, who was, I don't know if you know, anybody knows Richard, but he was a big TV star on the folk scene initially, and then a lot of TV shows, and he's got his own YouTube channel now." He said he's not very happy with the writers on the show. "I think you could write some stuff for him." So anyway, I wrote some stuff. By that time, my office had a fax machine, and I was able to write stuff and fax it to Richard, and he'd get it immediately. And I remember writing, I don't know where the idea came from. As I was growing up, the Beatles, I was a huge Beatles fan, but there always seemed to be someone who claimed themselves to be the fifth Beatle. It was like, the last count, there were about 400 of them. And I wrote this routine about the fifth Beatle and how many there were at the time. And Richard rang me up and he said, "Do you know," he said, I do a song called The Fifth Beatle. This would tie into nicely. I said, "I didn't know," but it was just... So we were obviously on the same wavelength. And so I took a couple of days off to go up to Brixton where they were rehearsing, met Richard for the first time, and I always remember the first thing he said was, "You've got a fag on you?" I said, "No, I don't smoke." But we got on great, and that first show was called Digance, and the special guest was Status Quo. Mike Osmond, who I'm writing stuff for now for Great British Radio, all these years later. He's a great impressionist as well. And from that, I wrote, must be 4 or 5 Richard Digance specials. Digance in Scotland, A Drop of Digance from Burton-on-Trent, Digance in the Field of His Own. We did a lot, and we did a series as well with a lot of great musical guests. And then Richard said at one point, "How do you fancy writing a play with me?" I said, "Sure." I mean, I'd never turn anything down. And bearing in mind by that time, I'm trying to think now, 91 was when I did Digance, and that's when I jumped ship from my insurance job. I had enough money to live on for a year, and I went full time. And I started working with Richard on a play. I had a good year that year. I wrote for quite a few shows. Joker in the Pack with Marty Kane up in Manchester. I did Rock with Laughter with Bobby Davro. And all of a sudden, the work stopped completely. January 1993. Sorry, January 1993. It just stopped. Phone didn't ring. And I was struggling. I ended up working in a warehouse and wishing I hadn't given up my day job. And it was like everybody I'd worked with had just gone away. And then I remember coming back. I worked in this warehouse. I used to come back in the afternoon. There was an answering machine. There was a message from my agent to say, they want you for a game show called Happy Families that was being filmed at the London Docklands Arena. And I went from earning nothing to earning £400 a day. It was only a week's work, but it was a gift from the gods, you know. And I was writing for Sarah Green, who was Going Live TV presenter, and Andrew O'Connor, who I knew, again shared an agent with, who is now a TV producer and stage producer. And I only had a week's work on it, but it was a game changer for me. And on the Sunday, it was on my last day there, Sarah Green said, "Someone told me you're going home tomorrow." I said, "Yeah, I've only been booked for the week." Anyway, I go home the next morning, and when I get home, there's a message, "Sarah Green wants you to write for her for this show for the next 2 weeks." So I had another 2 weeks' work, and it just turned everything around. And from that, John K. Cooper rang me up and said, "I want you to write the Royal Variety Show, 93. And I'd written for Mike Doyle, funny enough. 2 years before, I'd done some bits. My very first Royal Variety was 1991, the Victoria Palace. I wrote some bits and pieces for Mike Doyle. And so 2 years later, 93, I'm actually the script editor of the whole show. And Cilla was hosting it. And I'd written a sketch for Mel Gibson, who was going to be a surprise guest. He was coming over anyway to promote a movie, and they wanted him to, as they do on Royal Variety, to get these surprise guests turn up. And I wrote a blind date sketch for him and Cilla. Now, I've been told that Mel and his management had seen this sketch and approved it. So I turned up on the Saturday. We had 3 days rehearsal, Saturday, Sunday, Monday. I turned up at the Dominion Theatre. I meet Cilla for the first time, and Bobby was with her then. And she was really nice to me and liked the script, etc. On the Sunday, I rehearsed with Cilla and the Muppets. Frank Oz was there, Brian Henson. And I'd written stuff for Miss Piggy and Kermit and the 2 old guys, Statler and Waldorf, which we filmed separately. They were up in the box, and that was cut into the program when it went out. They were commenting on the acts. Well, on the Monday lunchtime, I get a message. You've got to go and see Mel Gibson at Planet Hollywood, where he's been screening his new movie. And Joe Pasquale and Bradley Walsh are there, and they're going, "What?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I've written the sketch. He's approved it. It doesn't matter. It's great. Everything's all right." I get in a cab, go to Planet Hollywood. I meet Mel Gibson and his manager, Bruce. I can't remember the guy's name. Of course, it's Bruce, Australian, isn't he? He was his business manager of Icon Productions, and I'm told they hadn't even looked at the script. So I'm sat there with people, various bods from the show, people from the Entertainment and Artists Benevolent Fund, for which the Royal Variety raises funds, and I'm sat there and I'm thinking, what am I going to do if he doesn't like the script? So I'm sat next to Mel Gibson. He's looking at the script of mine, and he read it, and then he read it again, and he said, I thought, my heart's sinking now. He said, it's a blatant plug for my film, isn't it? Because I do mention this new film in it. I said, yeah. He said, all right, I'll do it. And I walked out. I remember walking out of Planet Hollywood, and there were somehow people got to know that he was in there, and there were barriers keeping people back. And I wanted to phone my wife and say, I've just had lunch with Mel Gibson, and he's going to do it. And I couldn't find a public phone anywhere. And I walked all the way through Piccadilly. So I remember went to the Regent Palace Hotel, and there were a row of phones there. I remember ringing her at work and saying, I've just had lunch with Mel Gibson, and he's going to do the sketch. So I go back to the and this is the Welsh connection now. I go back to the theatre, speak to Cilla, speak to the Muppets. The Muppets, I didn't speak to the Muppets. I spoke to Brian Henson and Frank Oz, and they were happy with the script. And I bumped into Glyn Houston. Now, Glyn Houston was one of my favourite actors. And he was there because Harry Seacombe and Roy Castle, and I think Ruth Maddock, they were doing a number from Pickwick. And Glyn Houston was in it. And I was so thrilled that I'd met Mel Gibson, but I didn't care. My nerves had gone by now. And I walked up to Glyn Houston and said, "Excuse me, Mr. Houston," or "Call me Glyn." And we were having sandwiches and cakes and things, whatever. And I said, "I'm from Newport." I'm blurting out that I'm from Newport and I'm writing this show. And he said, "Oh, great." He said, "We must have another chat afterwards." Well, I did meet him years later at the BBC, but it was surreal to talk to Glyn Houston. I'd seen so many great movies, over the years, and TV shows. And I remember going to the hotel across the road from the Dominion, and I had to put the suit on, the dinner suit, and I couldn't. My hands were shaking so much with the responsibility of this show. This is 6 o'clock now before we recorded. I remember going to the dressing room, and in the Royal, because there's so many acts, the dressing room's a chocker. And in this particular dressing room, there was Brian Connolly, Frank Carson, Bradley, Joe Pasquale, there were about 5 or 6, Darren Day. And I remember Frank Carson had to do my dicky board because I was shaking so much with the responsibility. And the Bee Gees were on the show. Michael Barrymore, who was a big London weekend star at the time with My Kind of People, he was topping the bill. Bee Gees closed the first half. And the opening was, the musical that was on at the Dominion at the time was Grease. So they opened with a medley from Grease with Shane Ritchie, who was playing Kinnicky in it, and Craig McLachlan from Neighbours, and Debbie Gibson with the Stars. Well, years later, a couple of years later, Shane was playing the lead in it, and out of that, I got a lot of shows with Shane Ritchie Experience and Lucky Numbers and things. So it all kind of led one to the other, and for about best part of 9-10 years I was going from one show to the other. I was working on blind dates, and I remember one particular time we booked a holiday. Our friends had at a villa in Menorca, and we were going to go out there for 10 days or whatever on holiday. In the run-up to that, I was asked to write a Joe Pasquale book, write a book. They wanted very quickly. This was the June or July. They wanted it out in the October. I was working on a Richard Digance special and a radio series. I can't remember. Oh no, a Brian Connolly series and a Richard Digance radio show. So I had to forego the holiday. My wife went because she was staying with friends anyway. And I can remember getting up about 6 every morning, working on this book. I had a little electronic typewriter by that time that had a little plastic thing. You could just see one and I wrote the book in about 10 days. Some people will say, did it take you that long? But it came out, and it did very well. And it came out at the same time I wrote a special for Joe for Christmas as well. Then we had Sasha Distel was on the show. He came over, he was happy to come over on the Eurostar, came over, did his little bit. He sang, I've got a song that'll get you on your nerves. Got back on the Eurostar, went back to Paris. It was like, and we had Jim Bowen on the show, Norman Collier. It was just a great show to work on. Having been asked by London Weekend to write the script for the 93 Royal Variety, writing for Cilla and the Muppets and everybody else, 2 years later they came back to me and said, we'd like you to write on the 95 Royal Variety, again from the Dominion, and that one starred Cliff. He did a whole chunk of a musical he was in called Heathcliff. We had Take That, we had Lulu, a lot of big stars in it again, and the host that year was Des O'Connor. Now I knew, because I used to watch Des O'Connor Tonight for years and years and years, I knew he had two main writers, Neil Shand and Eric Davidson. And I thought, well, I'm happy to do it, but he's got his own guys, why would they want me on board? But I have to say, from the day I met them, they welcomed me as part of the team for that 3 or 4 days we were rehearsing. And about a year later, maybe 18 months later, I did read in the paper that Eric Davidson had passed away. So that would have been in the sort of July, August. Well, come September, I get a phone call from my agent to say that they want to try you out on the Des O'Connor Tonight Show. I said, well, I'm honoured to be asked. Well, he said, well, they're doing 12, I think maybe 12 or 14 shows. You'll be on the first half dozen, and they're going to try another writer out after Christmas in the remaining 6 or 7. Well, I was just happy to be on board, and so I remember going down to Teddington. I had theatrical digs then in Maida Vale, so it was quite a trek every morning. And I used to go in every day for production meetings from Maida Vale to Teddington, and then go down the high street to the studios. And I remember the first day I was there, nobody there knew that Eric Davidson had died. And so I'm sitting there in the dressing room waiting for Des to turn up, and people were walking in with coffees and teas, and who are you? And I said, well, Alan Wightman. Oh, what happened to Eric? I said, oh, didn't you know he passed away? And I kept, if they said what a lovely man he was about 10 times, by the time the 15th person came out, oh God. But anyway, we got on well, and I was then thrilled then at the end of the year to be told by Neil Shand, who was the head writer, that I would be asked to work on the remaining shows. And I'd always watched Des O'Connor Tonight because of the star value. There were so many stars. And this particular year, and it's funny how it came back to me years later, one particular show, another one, so I spent the afternoon talking to Ken Dodd in the dressing room. It was just magic for me. He was happy to talk about comedy and what works and why. It was a masterclass. And another time, on the same show, Freddie Starr and Sir Anthony Hopkins. And Anthony Hopkins came out. He was plugging a movie called about Picasso. I can't remember, Finding Picasso, I think it was called. And he came out. They showed the obligatory clip of the film, and then Des started to ask him about playing Picasso. And Tony Hopkins said, I don't want to talk about Picasso. I don't think he was very happy with the film, or he was just not in the mood. He said, I want to talk about Tommy Cooper. And we were all looking at each other. Well, what's this? Anyway, he started doing Tommy Cooper impressions, and really, really good ones, and remembering Tommy Cooper lines. Well, this went on for about 15 minutes, and the audience loved it. Then there was a technical breakdown. He got up and was working as Tommy Cooper to the audience for another 5 or 10 minutes, and I was introduced to him. It was most peculiar, because there's Sir Anthony Hopkins, and I knew his mother, because where we live in Newport, his mother used to live around the corner, and my mother and his mother used to go to the Royal Gwent Hospital on the bus together for appointments. It was just weird. So he must have thought I was some sort of stalker, because I said, I live around the corner from your mum, and it was like, what? But he had these intense blue eyes, remember, quite a stocky character, but he was fine afterwards. Anyway, Sir Anthony Hopkins goes, next on the bill, Freddie Starr. And he comes out with chatting. Years later, I'm working with Freddie on his autobiography. And we're talking about that Des O'Connor show. And he said, you know what happened? I said, no. He said, what happened was, they were in the green room together, Hopkins and Freddie Starr, and they were talking about Tommy Cooper. So it must have gone into Tony Hopkins' mind about Tommy Cooper, and that's why he was doing Tommy Cooper impressions for 20 minutes. It was sparked up a conversation with Freddie Starr. He was obviously not interested in plugging the movie. He was happy to talk about Tommy Cooper. So I got the series with Des on the back of that Royal Variety show, and I was told I was going to be on the next series, but something happened and they used somebody else, so I moved on, and I think I did Blind Date then with Cilla, who remembered me from the previous Royal Variety. And I got very friendly with a guy called Vince Powell. Vince had written a lot of sitcoms which are now considered not politically correct, but Vince and I had worked on a show called a play called The Spice of Life, and based basically on a home for retired entertainers, where the rivalries from who was on top of the bill and who was whatever was still there. And we had a couple of people, Penelope Keith in mind, playing the lady running the place. It was all sorts of... this shows you how things have moved on in television. Vince sent the script. We wrote it as a sitcom eventually, not a play. We wrote it as a sitcom, and he sent it himself to BBC. And I met him a couple of weeks later, and he showed me the letter he'd had back from the BBC. And it was a stock letter addressed to anybody who was going to send stuff in on spec. They had no idea who he was. And it said, this is how we write a sitcom. Perhaps you'd like to rewrite it and send it in to us. Well, his agent rang up the BBC, and he did get a meeting with somebody. And they said, we're not interested in... Well, the actual wording was, we found this script quite amusing. This is not the sort of thing we're looking for. So that's how things change in TV. Well, I was working a lot with Richard Digance. We wrote a play together called Sex, Spangles and Sensible Shoes, which toured the UK. We did 2 weeks at the Key Theatre, Peterborough, and then it toured. And Michael Media, great British actor, he was in it, and it did quite well around the country. And then one night, Richard rang me up and said, have you ever worked with Freddie Starr? And I said, well, I met him briefly on a Palladium show, but he wouldn't know me from Adam. He said, well, he's writing his autobiography. He's got a ghostwriter who is sacked. So that should have been a warning, shouldn't he? And this guy who has been writing with him, they had a falling out, and he was looking for someone to write this autobiography with him. And Richard shared the same manager, Brian Shaw, as Freddie. So he said, if you're interested, I'll tell Brian, and he'll tell Freddie, and Freddie will ring you. Well, a couple of weeks went by, and it was quite late one night. I was plumping up the cushions, ready to go to bed, and phone rang, and it was Freddie. It's Freddie here. I always sound like Max Wall when I say that. It's Freddie here. Could you come and see me tomorrow? And I said, well, it wasn't big time. I did have a meeting somewhere else the following day. So I said, no, I can see you, whatever. And so he said, all right. And he said, come to Reading Station and I'll pick you up. Because he was renting, because of tax reasons, he lived in Spain, but he renting Uri Geller's lodge at the end of Newry Geller's, the drive to his house for so many days. So I met him there, and his wife Donna picked me up from the station, took me to the house in Windsor, and we spent the day. He wanted to know what sort of comedians I liked, and I said, well, I like the classic ones, Hancock, the Goons, you know, I like Robin Williams, I liked the Naked Gun movies with Leslie Nielsen. We had a very common taste, you know, but really common. And anyway, I get home that night, and there's a phone call from my agent. Freddie spoke to his agent. He wants you to write the book. Okay. So what it meant was getting a train, and it's really, when I think about it, I should have booked a hotel somewhere in Windsor or Reading. I was getting the train up from Newport to Reading every day, being picked up either by Freddie or Donna, taken to the house, because by that time he moved to White Waltham, little village in just outside Windsor. And I'd spend the day with him, and I'd get dropped back to the station, get up, I'd have to go home, type up what I'd recorded. And this went on for about a week, 10 days, and it really got to me until this one particular morning. I remember getting to the house, and Donna, I think, had gone off somewhere for the day, and Freddie used to sit forward. He was a chain smoker. I'm tired now, I'm really tired, and Freddie's blowing cigarette smoke everywhere. And I committed the ultimate sin. I'm being paid to write your life story, and I'm recording you, and I'm falling asleep in front of you. I mean, when I think it, I still have chills thinking about it. My eyes started to close, and I hear these words, "Am I boring you?" It woke me up, and I said, "Look, how I thought I count on my fingers. I never, I just think on my feet. I just think, what do I say?" I said, "It's my contact lenses, Freddie." I said, "They're really hurting at the moment." "Oh, don't worry." He said, "Go to the downstairs loo." He said, "I got contact lens stuff in there." So I go in the downstairs loo, and I open the window, get fresh air, and I splash cold water on my face. And I go back in the room, and he's made another fresh pot of tea, and we're fine there. But it never happened again. And I think by then I'd had about 10 days worth of tapes to listen to anyway. So I was okay, I could go back and work at home for a week. But I never let that happen again, and I felt so awful, falling asleep in front of the person who was paying me to write his life story. But I managed to think on my feet, and I think I got away with it. And then I went out to Spain then. About 6 months, 7 months later, he rang me up and said, "Will you come out to Spain?" And he paid for the flights, etc. And I spent a week out there at his house. I say a house, it was a mansion overlooking Benalmádena in Spain. And I had the run. He had a basement that there must have been about 10 rooms. And I had my own kitchen. It was just great. And then every morning at about 9:30, 10 o'clock, I'd go up and we'd record all day. And then about 7, 8 o'clock, we'd pack in work, something to eat, watch a comedy movie. And it was just great. And that was in the February, March, and the book came out in the September 2001. And then I booked him for Money in the Bank. He came down to do that. And I saw him live a couple of times. And now, strange enough, I've been hired as a consultant on a TV documentary or a movie documentary about Freddie, which is utilising hours of footage of his final tour. The guys who were producing this film, they went on tour with him, and I've been asked to, because of my connection with the book, I've been asked to be consultant on it, which is great. We meet every now and again, and we have Zoom calls. But what was interesting was, many times I was going to throw out all the audio tapes from the interviews were in a box. There were about 25 audio tapes. And several times I was going to throw them out because what good are they to me? When I met the guys for the first time, these producers, and I happened to mention I've got the audio tapes, they went, "What? We'll have them, we'll buy them off you." But as it turns out, although I physically own the tapes themselves, the content of the tape, Freddie's voice, belonged to the Freddie Starr estate, i.e. his current wife. But that's all been sorted legally now, so I've been paid a nominal fee for the tapes, and I'll be getting a fee for being a consultant, and now they've asked me to write the script for it as well. So my connection with Freddie, 20 odd years on, bizarrely, is still there. 22 years on, and the documentary is quite difficult to put together because there's so much footage, backstage, interviews with people, the likes of Bobby Davro and people, etc. And hopefully, sometime towards the end of this year, it'll see the light of day. But that's Freddie, and I've also been asked to write an article for Infinity magazine, who've been very kind to me and asked me to write a few magazine articles about my career, about Freddie and my connection with him working on the book, which Infinity is by the way, it's a great ad for the magazine. It's a retro TV and movie magazine. If you're interested in old TV shows and old movies, you'll love it. So having worked on the Royal Variety in 1993 that Joe Pasquale was on, that year Joe was actually booked into the Grand Theatre here. When he was booked in the year before, they didn't know that he was going to be on the Royal Variety. That was so of course there was a huge new audience for him, and he wasn't. I think I'm trying to think who was top of the bill here that year, but it wasn't Joe. I think Cheryl Baker. It was Cheryl Baker and somebody from Trainer. The series was called Trainer. It was Mark Greenstreet, an actor, and Rod Hull and Emu. And because Owen Money was on the bill as well. Well, the following year, Joe was booked again, and it was that year, after I'd done the Joe Pasquale TV special, that Joe rang me up and said, "Look, I'm working with Owen Money, who I'd heard of but never seen working, and Owen's doing a TV show next year, but he's run out of material. But he doesn't know of any comedy writers in Wales. In fact, he actually said to Joe, there aren't any. And Joe said, well, there's Alan Wightman, and Owen had never heard of him, of me. So he arranged for me to come down here during the panto to meet Owen, which I did. And we got on well. He took me across the road there was a cafe here called the Highway Cafe that served fantastic chips. And we kind of threw ideas around. Roger Bell, who was then his kind of a roadie, or road manager, he was with him as well, who I got to know quite well over the years. Apparently he's the man who discovered Bonnie Tyler. Anyway, following year, I get a call from Owen. Yes, this series is going ahead. Would you have a meeting? And it was a series called Night Out with Money, which we did around Wales. Quite a cheap and cheerful show. We do 2 shows in each venue. One was at the Blackwood. There's a hotel in Blackwood, the Mice Manor. We did 2 up in North Wales and 2 down here in Swansea. And it did very well. So the following year, HTV, as it was then, or ITV1 Wales, wanted another series, but they had more money. And we did a series from Culverhouse Cross, another Night Out with Money, but there were 1-hour specials, and we had a lot of big names came down for it. A lot of 60s bands like the Searchers. We had Lindisfarne, we had Swinging Blue Jeans, the Trogs. So it was. We didn't reinvent the wheel. We just gave the audience on a Friday night what they wanted. Now the problem was that was ITV. On a Saturday morning, Owen Money was on Radio Wales, and people would ring in and say, "Loved the show last night, Owen." And he said, "We can't talk about it because it's on the other side." So it get to the point where whatever BBC Wales were putting out against it on that Friday night, nobody was watching. They were all watching A Night Out with Money. So he rang me up and said, look, BBC wants some ideas. Have you got any ideas? And as it happened, I'd worked on a pilot a year before in London. It was going to be for Chris Tarrant. It was called Street Party, where a TV crew would take over a particular street for a week. You'd meet all the various characters in the street. You'd find out who the nosiest neighbour was, who was the guy who cleans his car every day or whatever. And then in a local venue, they'd have a chart act to attract people, and they'd put a show on at the end. So it would be a 1-hour show with like a lifestyle type program all the way through. Till the last 15 minutes, it would be a bit of a pop show. And we went as far as the pilot stage, and it all collapsed. So Michael Hurl Television, who owned it, I rang them up and I said to Michael Hurl, look, I've got an idea, I can do something with this and bring it down a bit on a smaller scale. And we agreed, we did a deal, and I approached Geraint Evans, who was the head of BBC Wales Entertainment, with this idea, and he bought it. What BBC didn't know was that ITV, although they wanted another series of A Night Out with Money, couldn't do it for another 18 months because their budgets were used up. So it was just fortuitous that we were approached by the BBC, and we did this series which we changed from Street Party to Just Up Your Street, and became a wonderful success. We went all around Wales. We auditioned. We did the first auditions in Cardiff. I think we had about 800 people came down over the 3 days. It was crazy. It was unbelievable. And I was being a bit cheeky, and when Gareth Evans said, "Well, what do you want to do on the show?" Rather than just write jokes and send them in or write links for Owen, I said, "I want to be associate producer." And he said, "Yeah, okay then." So it meant me going in. I was at basically a proper job for 6 months of the year. And that lasted from 1998 right through to 2003, 2004, I think, when BBC gave it out to independents to do, and I didn't get involved in that. But around that time, Owen said to me, because Owen had been in Pantos here and New Theatre, he wanted to set his own company up, and would I be interested in writing a Panto script? I'd only ever done one before, and that was for Newport Pantomime Society many, many years before. But I'd seen loads of Pantos, I'd taken the kids to Pantos, and I was a big fan of Panto from quite young, because my cousin Carol, who was much older than me, she used to take me on my birthday, which is January, to the Newport Lyceum Theatre, and which always had a pantomime on. And my birthday present from her was to have a ticket to see the pantomime. And we always sat in the front row, right next to the orchestra. I'm in an orchestra pit, And the last panto I remember seeing there in 1961, the last panto at the Lyceum, before the council, in their wisdom, pulled it down. Beautiful old building. It was Sandy Powell was the star. Now, what was I, 11 then? I had no idea who Sandy Powell was. All I knew was he was a very, very funny man. He did a routine with a ventriloquist doll that the arms were getting longer and longer and longer. Sorry, I'm confusing the two acts now. He did an act where his arms were getting longer, and he had a ventriloquist with the head kept coming off. It was just funny visual stuff that a kid of 11 would love. So I must have seen 3 or 4 different pantomimes there. Never went to the New Theatre Cardiff. That was a bit too posh, but the Lyceum was fine. I went to the New Theatre Panto many years later, took my kids to see them. And one particular year, when I was working in London, I went to see 3 friends. They were in 3 different pantos. One was at Wimbledon, one was at Kingston, and one was at Richmond. I went to see 3 pantos over three days, and I met Buster Merrifield, who was Uncle Albert in Fools and Horses, and he was good as gold. I met Leslie Joseph, Michaela Strachan. It was just over 3 days. I think 2 of them were the same panto. There were 2 Peter Pans and a Mother Goose. So I was steeped in pantomime from a young age, and when Owen asked me to write them, I basically remembered all these old routines, had a story that you could hook them onto, and with Owen's input, which was vast, and I think he must have directed it. Our first one, Aladdin, did very, very well. We had Maureen Rees, who was then from driving school, Ian Rees, the actor, who was well known to Welsh TV audiences. We had Phil Harries, who was another great comic actor, and then we filmed it for BBC Wales, and it went out on New Year's Day. So basically, we grouped the following year, did a 1-hour version of it, and it worked very well. We had a couple of guests. Derek the Weatherman came in. Roy Noble played the Noble Executioner. It was just good fun. It was a 1-hour show we recorded at Blackwood Miners Institute. So since then, I've written for Owen, for First Choice Holidays, I've written pantomimes, and I had my first, if you like, before I wrote for Owen, my first big panto was here at the Grand Theatre. I wrote a Robin Hood for Little and Narge and Ruth Maddock. And that also starred, there were people from Neighbours and Emmerdale, and there was a guy from the British Empire, I can't remember the guy's name now. 4 or 5 big names in it, and Oh, he wasn't in that one, funny enough. He must have been in Cardiff that year. But that gave me a real sense of what pantomime's all about and how to put a script together. And I must have written about 30 since then. And then after Blind Date, I went back to BBC Wales. We did another series of Just Up Your Street. And in the same year, we did a thing called Money in the Bank. It was basically, the set was a nightclub called The Bank, owing money in the bank. And we had John Quirk and his band. Again, we had Tommy and Bobby came down to do a show, Joe Pasquale. I called in a lot of favours. Freddie came down to do one. Jimmy Cricket, Davro came down to do, he did two actually. And we had a lot of music acts. David Essex came down, Jimmy Nail. We had Tim Vine, he came down. It was just a great show. I thought, again, you don't reinvent the wheel, you just give the public what they want on a Friday night. And I think I must have had 6-7 years at BBC Wales, and then the music department took over the entertainment department, and my sort of entertainment show was phased out, and I went on to do other things like books and film. I eventually got a film made after 6 years of trying called Blood Moon, which is a Western werewolf movie. I got a short film made with the wonderful British actor Christopher Cazenove called Bloodline, which won a lot of awards at festivals, and he was a great actor to work with. I've also got 3 or 4 scripts out at the moment. I've written a Benny Hill biopic, which someone's looking at the moment, but everything seems to take forever. And even if you get one film made, or maybe 2, there's no guarantee these days, unless you've got a massive star and a big budget, you're never going to get it made. I think it's easier to get big budget movies made than things that cost about $1 million or $2 million, you know. But I continue today. I write for Great British Radio. I ghostwrite a comedian's blog. I write stuff for various journalists and comedians. And there's a couple of theatre projects I'm working on which may or may not happen. The weirdest one is a thing called Robin Hood in Central Park, which is a pantomime for New York audiences. And I've been working on this since 2017. And although it was performed in New York to the British School in New York in, I think it was February or March 29, just the weekend before COVID hit, and that put the kibosh on it. Although, strange enough, just last week I had a message from the producer to say it's still going ahead. We'll see, you know. So I'm always juggling projects and always happy to take on new projects. And here I am, 32 years after going full time, and almost 50 years now since I set out to write those first jokes and send them off handwritten, because I didn't know you had to have a typewriter.